The chamber was hushed, the kind of silence that weighs heavy, as if the air itself held its breath. All eyes were fixed on the elevated bench where Judge Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her expression sharp, almost surgical in its precision. Her voice cut through the quiet like a blade, crisp and deliberate. Designed not just to question, but to wound. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, each syllable laced with condescension, "do you truly believe that your limited experience qualifies you to interpret the weight of constitutional law in this matter? Or is this simply another attempt to politicize what should remain sacred?" The words hung in the air, heavy and damning, reverberating against the polished walls like the crack of a gavel. For a moment, the room itself seemed stunned. A ripple moved through the crowd, an audible gasp, a few sharp whispers, the shuffling of feet from those who couldn't contain their unease. Cameras pivoted swiftly, locking onto Jasmine Crockett, as though the nation were collectively leaning in closer. Barrett sat back, her lips pressed in a self-assured line, the posture of someone certain she had delivered the decisive blow. It wasn't just a question. It was an indictment, an attempt to shrink Crockett in front of her peers, to reduce her to a caricature of inexperience. In the gallery, heads turned toward Crockett. Some faces bore the smug grin of those already anticipating her collapse. Others reflected a quiet hope, silently urging her to stand tall. It was more than a question of LUT, was a test of dignity. Clash of power against presence. Crockett sat poised, her hands resting calmly, her eyes steady. She did not flinch. Silence stretched, a tension so sharp it could snap at any second. Barrett's challenge had landed like a gauntlet thrown at her feet, daring her to pick it up or be crushed beneath it. The air in the chamber thickened with anticipation. This was not the kind of silence that precedes surrender right, was the silence. Before a storm, every lens, every pen, every heartbeat seemed to wait for the first crack of thunder. But no one in that chamber was ready for what Crockett said next. This was not just a clash between two women in a courtroom. It was a confrontation between two worlds, two Americas, two visions of who gets to belong and who is told to stay quiet. Judge Amy Coney Barrett did not merely question Jasmine Crockett's qualifications. She had called into doubt the very legitimacy of black women in power. Her words carried the weight of centuries of dismissal, echoing a familiar refrain that countless trailblazers before Crockett had endured: "You are too new, too untested, too unworthy." The attack was surgical in its intent. By framing Crockett as inexperienced, Barrett was reinforcing the elitist idea that only those who had been groomed within narrow institutions deserved to interpret justice. It was not simply about lot, it was about gatekeeping, about a fortress of privilege designed to keep out voices that challenged the old order. In that moment, Barrett was not just a judge. She was the embodiment of an institution that had time and again tried to silence those who dared to disrupt its polished surface with the raw truth of lived experience. And yet, Crockett represented something larger than herself. She carried into that chamber the weight of every woman who had been told she wasn't ready. Every immigrant child who had been told their dreams were too big. Every voter who believed that democracy should not belong only to the powerful few. Her silence in those first seconds was not hesitation. It was the gathering of strength. The calculation of someone who knew that her words would not just defend herself, but reverberate far beyond those four walls. The stakes stretched far past that courtroom. If Barrett's words were allowed to stand unchallenged, it would serve as a chilling reminder to aspiring leaders from marginalized backgrounds. Know your place. Stay in line. Don't dare to think you can speak with authority. But if Crockett responded with precision, with fire and composure, she could dismantle more than a single insult. She could unravel the myth that elitism equates to wisdom, that dignity belongs only to those born into it. The people in the gallery could feel it, even if they couldn't yet articulate it. They leaned in not simply out of curiosity, but out of a hunger to witness history, to see whether one woman's courage could puncture the marble armor of institutional power. Cameras hovered, capturing every flicker of expression, every shift. In the atmosphere, the moment was not just about Crockett, it was about the millions watching from their living rooms. their phones, their classrooms, searching for proof that the system could be spoken back to. For Barrett, it was a performance of dominance. For Crockett, it was a test of endurance. For America, it was a mirror reflecting back the question of who belongs at the table of power and who is forever relegated to the margins. And so, as the silence lingered and Crockett prepared to speak, the chamber itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. What she was about to say would not be confined to the transcript of this trial. It would ripple outward, shaping headlines, sparking debates, igniting movements. Because what happened next wasn't just a response, it was a turning point. To understand the weight of Judge Amy Coney Barrett's words in that chamber, one has to step back and examine the story she carried with her into that trial. Barrett had risen through the ranks as a conservative star, meticulously cultivated by an establishment eager to secure its power for decades to come. Her confirmation to the Supreme Court was hailed by her supporters as a triumph of tradition and faith, while her critics warned it was a dangerous consolidation of ideology under the guise of neutrality from the very beginning. Her rulings reflected the sharp edges of her worldview on matters of reproductive rights, workers' protections, and immigration. Barrett leaned consistently toward restraint, not restraint of government power, but restraint of the individual. She became a symbol of the legal fortress that kept progress on the outside looking in. Each decision was framed in language of constitutional fidelity. Yet many saw in her opinions a chilling consistency, a narrowing of rights for the vulnerable, a widening of authority for the powerful. Her authority, at least in public image, was undeniable. She spoke with precision, wore her intellect like armor, and carried herself with the solemn weight of the bench. To her admirers, she was a woman who had shattered ceilings within conservative ranks, proving that devout conviction and professional ambition could coexist. To her detractors, she was the embodiment of elitism cloaked in humility, a judge who spoke softly even as her rulings thundered against those already on the margins. And then there were the controversies, the moments where her image of impartiality cracked. Critics pointed to speeches where she leaned into faith-infused rhetoric, raising alarms about the boundary between personal conviction and constitutional duty. Others noted her alignment with powerful conservative networks that had groomed her path to prominence. She projected independence. Yet her trajectory was inseparable from the machinery that had elevated her. The irony was unmistakable. The more Barrett projected unshakable authority, the more fragile her legitimacy seemed to those outside her ideological camp. Her confidence, her calm certainty, became its own kind of vulnerability because it made her appear insulated, detached from the lived realities of those her rulings affected. Where she saw principle, others saw dismissiveness. Where she saw discipline, others saw coldness. Patterns emerged over time. When progressive lawmakers or activists challenged her, she rarely engaged directly. Instead, she responded with carefully measured disdain, a polite dismissal that implied not only disagreement but irrelevance. To those watching, it wasn't simply her rulings that stung, it was the way she brushed aside dissent, as if it were unworthy of serious consideration. That subtle air of elitism became her signature. The quiet superiority of someone who believed the institution was always on her side, and in many ways, it had been. For years, Barrett's dominance in the legal arena seemed untouchable. She had weathered tough hearings, stood her ground in contentious debates, and maintained the unwavering support of powerful allies. She knew the weight of her robes, and she wore them like a shield against criticism. Yet those very qualities that cemented her authority also made her brittle. Because when authority depends on projection in the appearance of control, any crack in the facade becomes catastrophic. And Barrett, for all her polish, carried within her the same vulnerability that haunts every figure who confuses institutional power with invincibility. That was the backdrop against which she launched her attack on Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't just a question about experience, it was an assertion of hierarchy, a reminder of who was supposed to be small and who was destined to loom large. In Barrett's eyes, Crockett was not a peer. She was an interloper, a challenger. from the outside, daring to speak with authority in a chamber that had long belonged to voices like Barrett's. But this time, the pattern would not hold. The dismissiveness that had silenced so many others was about to falter. The irony of Barrett's authority that its strength masked fragility was about to be laid bare in front of the cameras, the gallery, and a nation hungry for a shift. In power, because in this trial, her usual dominance was about to collapse. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that chamber, before the cameras followed her every move, and before the nation waited for her words, she was forged in places far less glamorous but infinitely more demanding. Her story didn't begin with political ambition. It began in courtrooms where the stakes weren't ideology but survival, where the clients she represented often had little more than their dignity left to defend. As a young attorney, Crockett built her career not by chasing prestige but by fighting for those the system seemed designed to forget. She represented indigent clients, the ones who couldn't afford seasoned counsel but deserved no less than justice. It was there, in those cramped offices, and under the unrelenting fluorescent lights of local courthouses, she honed her craft. She learned that words could be weapons, but only if wielded with precision. She learned that composure under pressure mattered more than theatrics. And above all, she learned that every small victory carried the weight of lives changed. Her courtroom style became unmistakable. Fiery when provoked, calm when strategy demanded it, relentless in pursuit of fairness. Judges raised eyebrows at her tenacity. Opposing counsel bristled at her unwillingness to back down. She wasn't there to win. Popularity contested, she was there to carve out space where her clients could be heard, even when the system seemed deaf. Each case hardened her resolve, deepened her conviction, and added to the quiet arsenal of resilience she carried within. But Crockett's fight was never confined to legal briefs and closing arguments. She stepped into the streets when her community needed her, lending her voice during protests, speaking truth at rallies, standing alongside those who demanded equity. She knew the law could only reach so far if it was not backed by the power of the people. Her advocacy stretched beyond courtrooms into neighborhoods overlooked by policymakers, where promises of opportunity rarely translated into reality. It was there she earned trust not as a distant representative, but as someone who lived and breathed the same struggles as the people she defended. Her path to Congress was anything but smooth. She faced dismissals, underestimation, and the quiet but ever-present skepticism reserved for black women daring to seek power. Opponents questioned her experience, pundits mocked her style, critics labeled her to outspoken or to radical. Yet each barrier only sharpened her resolve. Crockett was not interested in fitting neatly into the mold of what a politician was expected to be. She was determined to redefine it. When she finally won her seat, it was not with the backing of vast wealth or dynastic connections. It was with the voices of communities that had been waiting for someone who would fight with them, not simply speak for them. She carried into the halls of Congress the stories of people who had been silenced, the faces of clients who had looked to her as their last hope, the struggles of families who believed the American dream should not be reserved for a select few. Her presence on the national stage was electric. When she spoke, she didn't recite sterile talking points. She delivered testimony carved from lived experience. Her speeches echoed with the rhythm of someone who had argued for justice in front of skeptical judges and juries. Someone who understood how to cut through doubt with clarity and conviction. Each time she took the microphone, she wasn't speaking. For herself, she was channeling the millions who had been told their voices didn't matter. And yet, through all of it, Crockett carried herself with a blend of humility and fire. She was never under the illusion that she alone could transform the system. But she believed with unshakable certainty that every act of resistance, every word spoken in truth, could bend the arc just a little closer to justice. That belief was not naive, it was born of scars, of nights when she questioned whether the fight was worth it, of moments when victory felt impossible. But she always returned, because surrender was never an option. So when she sat in that chamber, listening to Judge Barrett's words cut at her credibility. Crockett was not simply a freshman lawmaker being challenged by an established authority. She was the culmination of every courtroom battle where she refused to be silenced, every protest where she stood shoulder to shoulder with her community, every fiery speech that carried the weight of truth against the odds. She was not intimidated, she was prepared. The silence that followed Barrett's attack was heavy, but Crockett's silence was different. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who had carried the weight of dismissal before and turned it into strength. It was the silence of someone who had been underestimated 100 times and learned that patience often precedes the most devastating blows. All of those struggles led to this one moment, where silence wasn't an option. Judge Barrett adjusted. Her glasses, her tone sharpening as if she could slice through Crockett's composure with nothing more than words. "So let me be clear," she pressed, her voice echoing in the chamber. "You admit that your professional history is largely centered on criminal defense, not constitutional interpretation. Doesn't that, by definition, limit your ability to weigh in on matters of this magnitude? Isn't it, in fact, dangerous to conflate advocacy with jurisprudence?" The words landed with the precision of a prosecutor cross-examining a witness, designed not to seek truth, but to corner, to trap, to humiliate. Barrett leaned back slightly, satisfied with the implication, as though she had already won the exchange. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her posture remained calm, her expression neutral, her silence deliberate. She had faced prosecutors more ruthless than this, judges who dismissed her arguments without a second thought, opponents who thought intimidation would force her to fold. She had survived all of them. Barrett's attempt to corner her was familiar terrain. Another moment where arrogance believed it could outmuscle dignity. The crowd felt the tension tighten, like a rope pulled taut. Murmurs rippled across the gallery, some shaking their heads at Barrett's brazenness, others whispering nervously, waiting to see if Crockett would finally falter. Pens scratched across notepads as reporters sensed a headline in the making. The air thickened, as if even oxygen were hesitant to move freely between the two women locked in a silent standoff. Barrett pushed again, her voice hardening, carrying that subtle air of superiority she had perfected. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, this trial is not a platform for speeches or political theater. It is a place for law, for precedent, for clarity, and frankly, your attempts to inject emotion into this proceeding undermine its seriousness." Accusation wasn't just about Crockett's response, it was about her identity. Emotion, passion, fire. These had always been coded dismissals for black women in public life, shorthand for unprofessional, unqualified, unworthy. The irony of course was that Barrett herself was performing, staging her own theater of authority in front of the cameras. Yet she projected it as fact, as if her voice alone carried the weight of law, while Crockett's was reduced to spectacle. Still, Crockett refused to bow. Her eyes remained fixed on Barrett, unshaken, a calm current running beneath the storm. She didn't raise her voice, didn't interject prematurely, didn't scramble to fill the silence. Instead, she let Barrett continue to swing, her words growing sharper but less effective with each attempt, like a blade dulled by overuse. In the audience, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The murmurs grew louder, not in Barrett's favor, but in skepticism of her relentless tone. People exchanged glances that said what they didn't dare whisper aloud. She was pressing too hard, exposing not Crockett's weakness but her own desperation to dominate. Authority was supposed to speak for itself. Barrett was working too hard to prove it. Crockett's restraint became its own kind of power, a mirror reflecting Barrett's arrogance back at her. The more the judge pressed, the more Crockett's dignity stood out in contrast. Every second she held her ground, every measured breath she took, amplified the imbalance between the two women. What Barrett intended as an interrogation was becoming, before the eyes of the nation, performance of intimidation. Crockett's unflinching calm was dismantling it piece by piece. The energy in the chamber shifted again. Reporters paused, mid-sentence, sensing that the story was evolving in real time. Viewers glued to their screens leaned forward, sensing that something bigger than a courtroom clash was unfolding. Barrett's dominance, once unshakable, was beginning to fray, and Crockett's silence carried the weight of inevitability. And then Crockett leaned forward, and the room fell silent. The silence stretched long enough to feel eternal. Reporters held their pens mid-air, as if afraid to miss a single word. Even Barrett herself seemed poised, chin lifted, waiting for the inevitable collapse of her opponent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't collapse. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on the judge, and spoke in a voice steady, deliberate, and unshakably clear. "Your Honor," she began, each syllable sharp but calm. "I spent years in courtrooms where my clients were told they didn't belong, where their voices were minimized, their pain dismissed, their humanity overlooked. And I can't help but notice that what you're attempting, hear this dismissal of my background. My experience isn't about the law. It's about power, and who gets to have it." The words did not rush. Crockett let them breathe, allowing each phrase to strike the chamber like a hammer hitting stone. Barrett's expression flickered, just for a second. A tightening around the jaw, a blink that lingered too long, was subtle but enough to suggest that for the first time in the exchange, she had not anticipated the direction of the blow. Crockett continued, her cadence gathering force, though her volume never rose beyond the threshold of authority. "You say my work in criminal defense is irrelevant to constitutional law. But let's be real. What is the Constitution, if not a promise of justice? A promise to every man, woman, and child that they are equal under its protection. My entire career has been about holding this country accountable to that promise. That isn't a weakness, Judge, that is the point." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pens scratched furiously. Cameras zoomed tighter on Crockett's face. Capturing the unwavering confidence etched into her expression, she paused, letting the silence hold again before dropping the next weight. "You call passion a threat to the seriousness of this proceeding. But passion is what every American mother feels when she sends her child to school and prays they'll come home safe. Passion is what drives a worker to stand up when their wages are stolen. Passion is what keeps our democracy alive. That's theater. Then it's a stage we're all standing on." Gasps. A few claps broke the silence before being quickly hushed. Barrett's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she could control the room through sheer will. But the chamber was already slipping out of her grip. Crockett leaned in closer, her voice dropping lower, forcing everyone to strain toward her words. "Let's talk about credibility. My credibility doesn't come from titles handed down or robes worn. It comes from the people who trusted me with their lives when the system tried to crush them. It comes from walking into rooms where no one wanted to hear the truth and speaking it anyway. You see elitism as authority. I see lived experience as truth. And truth, Judge, doesn't need permission to speak." The chamber was dead silent. Now, even the shuffle of papers, the clicking of keyboards had stopped. Every pair of eyes locked on Crockett as though gravity itself pulled them there. Barrett tried to interject, "Congresswoman," but Crockett raised a hand, not rudely, but firmly, the way one commands order in a courtroom. The move stunned the room. She wasn't just answering, she was reclaiming space. "No," she said softly, but the softness carried a sharper edge than any shout. "You've had your say. Now you'll listen." The crowd erupted not in noise, but in energy. The chamber felt electric, as if every molecule had been charged with a sudden jolt of power. Crockett rose slightly in her seat, her eyes never leaving Barrett. "When women who look like me enter these halls of power, we are told we don't belong. When we speak, we're told we're too loud. When we stay silent, we're told we have nothing to contribute. And now when we stand toe-to-toe with authority, we're told we're unqualified. But I'm here to tell you and everyone watching that this isn't about me. It's about the generations of women who refuse to be silent. And it's about the young girls watching this trial who will not ask for permission to speak truth to power." The chamber gasped, then broke into scattered applause before the gavel slammed for order. Even the gavel sounded weak against the current running through the room. Barrett's composure cracked further. Her eyes darted toward the gallery, toward the cameras, her lips pursing as if to summon a retort, but nothing came. She adjusted her papers unnecessarily, the hallmark of someone searching for grounding. Her power, so absolute at the beginning, now looked brittle an edifice, beginning to crumble under the weight of its own cracks. Crockett sat back, her words hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. She had not raised her voice, had not begged for validation, had not lashed out in anger. She had done something far more devastating. She had turned Barrett's own attack into a mirror, reflecting elitism and arrogance back onto its source. And the audience knew it. They felt it in their bones. What they had just witnessed was not a defense, it was a counterattack, one that had shifted the entire balance of the trial. For a long, suspended moment, Barrett said nothing. Her silence screamed, louder than any argument. The authority she wielded so easily before now looked exposed, fragile, human. She adjusted her robe again, cleared her throat, tried to reassert control, but the room had already chosen its hero. Reporters glanced at one another, eyes wide, the story writing itself in their minds. Viewers watching at home leaned closer to their screens, some with tears in their eyes, others with fists clenched in exhilaration. The chamber was no longer just a courtroom. It was a battlefield where something bigger had been decided. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived Barrett's attacks, she had reversed it, transformed it, weaponized it. In less than 10 minutes of speaking, she had shifted the narrative from being the defendant of her credibility to the embodiment of resilience, justice, and truth. The gavel struck again. Harder this time. "Order!" Barrett demanded, her voice tighter, sharper, but also finally betraying a tremor. The sound rang hollow. Crockett didn't need to add another word. Her silence now carried more force than any statement could. She leaned back, her eyes never wavering, her very posture declaring victory. And then, it's almost like a cinematic cue, the crowd broke into applause, real, uncontainable, undeniable applause. Some stood, some clapped through tears, others shook their heads in disbelief. At what they had just witnessed, security and clerks scrambled to restore order. The eruption was unstoppable. Barrett slammed the gavel again, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of affirmation pouring from the gallery. She had lost not just the exchange, but the room, the moment, and the story that would live long after. Finally, as the crowd quieted, Crockett's last words lingered in the air, etched into every heart and headline. "We belong here. And no robe, no title, no intimidation will change that." The room held its breath. Barrett lowered her gavel slowly, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Her silence confirmed what everyone already knew: she had no recovery, and the cliffhanger loomed a truth bigger than the four walls of that chamber. But outside that courtroom, the response was even louder. The courtroom may have fallen into silence after Jasmine Crockett's words, but the world outside erupted like a dam, finally breaking. Within minutes of the exchange, hashtags began to light up across every platform. By the time Crockett had even left the building, one stood above the rest. Hashtag Crockett clapback. It surged like wildfire, carried by those who had watched the moment live, and amplified by those who had only seen the clipped version, already spreading across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram Reels. The videos were everywhere, edited with dramatic sound effects, paired with captions like "This is how you answer elitism," or "Queen energy in a courtroom." TikTok creators stitched themselves into the clip, pointing at the screen with wide-eyed disbelief before breaking into applause. Memes flooded timelines, Barrett's stiff expression juxtaposed with Crockett's fire, turned into viral GIFs that captured the generational collision in one perfect loop. Commentators were quick to seize the narrative. On progressive podcasts, voices were electric with excitement. "This isn't just a soundbite," one host declared. "It's a signal. This is what happens when the old guard underestimates a new voice and loses." Editorial columns framed it as more than a clash of personalities. It was painted as a symbolic generational war, the entrenched guardians of privilege versus the insurgent voices of representation and grit. Television anchors replayed the footage in slow motion, dissecting every pause, every glance, every tonal shift in Crockett's delivery. Some conservative commentators attempted to downplay the exchange, dismissing it as grandstanding. But their dismissal only underscored the resonance of her words. The energy was undeniable, the kind of cultural lightning that could not be ignored or talked away. Celebrities and cultural figures added their voices to the storm. A-list actors retweeted the clip with simple captions like "iconic." Musicians posted Instagram stories calling Crockett a truth-teller. Activists saw it as fuel for their own causes, framing her rebuttal as part of a wider movement for dignity in the face of entrenched power. Politicians who had once hesitated to embrace Crockett were suddenly eager to stand beside her, issuing statements praising her courage. What had begun as a tense courtroom clash was now reshaping political conversations across the country. The generational contrast became a defining theme. Barrett was cast as the embodiment of an establishment. Clinging to authority, her attack remembered less as a question and more as an attempt at suppression. Crockett, by contrast, became a lightning rod of inspiration, someone who spoke not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever felt belittled, doubted, or dismissed by the powerful. News outlets ran split-screen montages. On one side, Barrett's pointed expression. On the other, Crockett's unwavering gaze and calm, devastating reply. The narrative was irresistible authority confronted by authenticity, and authenticity winning. But perhaps the most powerful voices were not celebrities or pundits, but ordinary people. Hashtags were filled with personal testimonies. Black women sharing their own stories of being underestimated in professional spaces. Young activists talking about how they felt seen in a way they hadn't before. Immigrant families describing the pride of watching someone challenge elitism with such grace and precision. The moment had transcended politics. It had become personal. And as the clip replayed across America, the response grew louder, bolder, more insistent. This was no longer just about one trial or one courtroom exchange. It was about a shift in the national psyche, a refusal to accept that voices from the margins, which must remain quiet in the face of entrenched power. Yet the biggest takeaway wasn't just political, it was moral. In the days following the clash, noise of politics carried on as it always does. Press, conferences, punditry, spin cycles. But Jasmine Crockett's words lingered, replayed not just on screens but in conversations at kitchen tables, classrooms, union halls, and community centers. What gave her response such resonance wasn't only the sharpness of her counterattack. It was the dignity woven into every syllable. She didn't need to shout or posture. She didn't stoop to the level of arrogance that Barrett had displayed. Instead, Crockett reframed the attack itself, transforming a moment of intimidation into a declaration that truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, could not be silenced. Her calm rebuttal was more than an answer to a judge's provocation. It was a message to anyone who had ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or accept less. Crockett's power came from the simple choice to hold her ground, not with rage, but with respect for herself and the communities she represented. In that sense, her victory was less about defeating an opponent and more about reminding America what leadership rooted in humility looks like. As her story spread, commentators began tying her words to the long arc of justice movements in America. Crockett, they argued, was part of a lineage, civil rights attorneys who had fought against segregated courtrooms, black women leaders who had challenged institutional dismissal, and everyday citizens who had risked everything to insist their voices mattered. What made this moment distinct was its visibility. Millions of people in real time saw the symbolic walls of elitism cracking. It was a woman from Dallas, with fire in her heart and history at her back, who swung the hammer. The emotional crescendo of Crockett's stance wasn't just in her courtroom delivery, but in the way she tethered her individual resilience to a collective struggle. When she spoke, she carried with her the overlooked, the underestimated, and the unheard. She showed that the fight for equality is not only waged in marches and protests, but also in the quiet courage to answer arrogance with composure, to answer power with truth. And in that reflection lies the universal lesson. America is not the property of the powerful. It does not belong solely to the institutions, the dynasties, or the entrenched voices that have dominated its halls. America belongs to every voice, every community, every individual who dares to step forward and speak. Crockett's response was not simply a personal triumph, it was a reminder that democracy demands participation from all corners, and that the measure of true power is not in silencing others, but in making space for them. For viewers who watched, the moral landed. Deeply, courage is contagious. A single moment of resolve can ripple outward, emboldening countless others to act with the same dignity. People began to ask themselves, what would I do in her shoes? Would I meet intimidation with silencer? Would I answer with truth? The resonance of that question ensured that Crockett's impact extended beyond politics and into the moral imagination of the nation. And so, the trial that was meant to corner her instead became a stage where she redefined the terms of power. The judge may have entered that chamber as the presumed authority, but Crockett left it as the one who commanded respect. In the end, this was never just about one courtroom, one clash, or one viral clip. It was about a shift in understanding that true authority is not measured in titles or robes, but in integrity and courage. And that's why her response flipped more than a trial. It flipped the script on power itself. Judge Amy Coney Barrett may have entered that courtroom cloaked in authority, her words sharpened into an attack meant to corner Jasmine Crockett. But as we've seen, the true story wasn't about the power of the bench. It was about the strength of a voice that refused to be diminished. Barrett's arrogance tried to silence, yet Crockett's dignity refused to bow. This clash became more than a legal sparring match. It became a parable of our time. The old guard relying on intimidation versus a new generation wielding truth and resilience. The outcome wasn't decided in statutes or precedents, but in the courage of one woman to hold her ground when the world expected her to fold. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Crockett didn't just win in exchange, she flipped the narrative. She showed us all that true authority is not imposed from above, but earned by standing firm in what's right. That's why her response continues to resonate. It wasn't just political, it was deeply human. And now, the question turns to you. What does this moment mean for the story we tell about America? About who belongs at the table, whose voices matter, and what kind of leadership we choose to follow? If you believe that courage should always speak louder than power, if you believe that truth has no robe, no title, no gatekeeper, then don't let this moment fade, but share it. Keep the conversation alive. Subscribe to this channel and join a community that isn't just watching history unfold, but rewriting the script together. Because Crockett's voice was more than a rebuttal. It was an invitation. An invitation to every one of us to rise, to speak, and to claim our place in America's story.